Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Hecker. I'm the Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs and Provost here at the University of Maine. And it's a real pleasure for me to welcome you to this symposium in honor of the inauguration of Joan Farini Mundy as the 21st President of the University of Maine. I'm pleased that so many of you are here and have joined us for this conversation. You're all special. Some are more special than others, so I'm going to mention that. I want to particularly welcome President Emerita of the University of Maine, Dr. Susan Hunter, back to campus. And we're very pleased to have the Director of the National Science Foundation, Dr. Franz Cordova, here. And even though he just walked through the door and he's a few minutes late, I'll introduce from the University of Maine Systems Board of Trustees, Greg Johnson. Greg. So I think this audience is pretty familiar with the challenges that face higher education in the United States right now. And the challenges come from a variety of sources and a variety of directions. Advances in technology are challenging us. Changes in demographics, fewer of the students we used to call traditional are populating or are coming into our institutions. There's a greater expectation of accountability with our funding agencies, with parents, with students. Employers are looking to us, and they're raising their expectations about what they want from students coming out of universities. At the same time, you can think of each of these challenges as an opportunity. And I particularly emphasize what's happening in technology. I think about the opportunities that creates for us to educate students in different ways. You think about the shifts in demographics. And if you change the way we think about that a little bit, it creates fabulous opportunities for institutions to think about how we do our business and what are our goals and aims and how can we do them better. And I even think the increase in accountability, although I may complain about it from time to time, is a positive thing and presents fabulous opportunities for institutions that are willing to embrace these opportunities, to be forward-thinking and to see how they can help lead the country. In today's symposium, we're going to explore some of these challenges. We're going to invite you into a conversation about them. So let me lay out how we've got this planned. We'll start with our keynote speaker, who will present some of her ideas and some research on just what are some of these issues facing higher education and what are some of the innovative ways people are meeting these challenges. After that, I'm going to invite 4 panelists who are distinguished University of Maine faculty and leaders to join us up here on stage for a conversation, somewhat reacting to what they've heard from the keynote and somewhat led by some questions that I have for them. And then we're going to invite you all into the discussion, hear what your thoughts are, give you the opportunity to challenge us to think a little bit about how we move forward as institutions of higher ed. So it gives me a great pleasure then to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Susan Rundle-Singer. She just told me keep it brief, so I will. I'll throw out the pages 2, 3, and 4. Dr. Singer is the Vice President for Academic Affairs and Provost at Rollins College. Previously, she was the Division Director for Undergraduate Education at the National Science Foundation and the Lawrence McKinley Gould Professor in Biology and Cognitive Science at Carleton College. Now, her career has really, in the various roles as a teacher, as a scientist, as a leader, has focused on improving undergraduate education by the integration of science and education and bringing that to scale. Her current research focuses on networks of organizations working to advance undergraduate STEM education. Dr. Singer earned her PhD in biology from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. She's a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and she's the past chair of AAAS's education section She currently serves on the National Academies of Science and Engineering and Medicine's Board of Life Sciences. She's a prolific author and scholar. Among her publications are 2 introductory biology textbooks. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Singer to the podium.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity to be part of celebrating Joan's inauguration. And hello to my NSF colleagues. What an unexpected pleasure to see you back there. I hope I can lay a framework for a very promising conversation that we'll have in a short while. And in thinking about how I wanted to talk about this very broad space of improving success for all of our learners. In the context of the University of Maine, I went first to Maine's mission statement, because our mission statements are our promise to our students. And some of the things that really stood out for me in the mission at Maine is the deep commitments to excellence and innovation in addressing complex challenges through research-based knowledge. And that said Dr. Farini-Mundi all over it. And then the other piece that resonated was integrating the teaching, the research, scholarship, and creative work, and the comprehensive outreach that a Land and Sea Grant University delivers so well. And all of this in support of a truly inclusive approach to supporting the public good. So I've tried to use these themes as an organizing principle for my remarks. And I wanted to start out by saying that when I had the privilege of working at the National Science Foundation, Joan led a wonderful strategic planning exercise, and in the end, helped us all think about education in 3 large categories, right? So learning and learning environments, K to gray, formal, informal, all that space with the extension work that we see, as well as what happens in the classrooms for our undergrads and our graduate students, broadening participation and preparing the future workforce. So you have a leader who's been thinking hard and delivering in these spaces for a good long time. What I think has changed in the way we think about student success over the last decade is we're moving beyond the really hard work we still have to do with increasing learning within traditional settings to really thinking comprehensively about how we help our students thrive. And I'm particularly taken with the work that the Gallup-Purdue poll has done, looking at over 30,000 individuals, looking at what workforce engagement looks like globally and how that links to quality life, not just great work. And in that research, they've identified 6 key drivers of success in life and work. The slightly unsettling news is that of all the graduates they surveyed from all different types of institutions of higher education in the United States, only 3% of those students report experiencing all 6 of these. 14% experience the 3 key relational pieces, that they had a professor that excited them about learning, that they had a professor that cared about them, and they had a mentor that encouraged their hopes and their dreams. Surely we can do that for more of our students, especially because we know there's solid evidence that this increases their success in life. And in terms of the experiences that change lives, We know that only 6% of all students have all three of these. A long-term project, and long-term is a semester or longer. It could be a research experience, it could be a creative experience. An opportunity to apply what they've learned in an internship or a job, and the opportunity to be involved in extracurricular activities or organizations. It doesn't just mean playing on the football team. There's a wide interpretation there. And all this is important because now more than ever, we need graduates that are adaptive and flexible, and they're going to be prepared for lifelong learning, right? So we got to think more and more about how we prepare our students for learning in the workplace. And again, I think our land-grant institutions are models to look to because they've been doing this for a very long time. On my last visit to UMaine several years ago, I had the privilege of going with a faculty member who was doing some work with blueberry growers, right? That's workplace learning. So what about this spaghetti diagram that I have up here? Why did I do this? This actually comes from a report I'm going to refer to in a moment called Robot Ready. It's a very catchy term. We'll unpack it in a moment. A data analytics firm looked at over 106 million public resumes and other employment records that are out there, took advantage of data analytics and asked if we look at students graduating in different sectors, this one happens to be a broad range of majors we might consider liberal arts versus professional degrees. What sectors do they work in for their first, their second, and their third jobs? So the key takeaway from this is it really does look like spaghetti, right? Students are moving between different sectors, even in their first three jobs, and we know that current students will change jobs many more times, 8, 9 times, and they're going to be working in jobs that don't even exist yet. So how do we do more than train our students to take that job 6 weeks out? How do we ensure that they're really well prepared? And how do we think about the work of the future? Okay, and I'm intentionally saying work of the future, not the future of work, but the work of the future, right? Where we have artificial intelligence and all other kinds of things. What does the human add to that? And basically they add a lot. So again, this is out of Strata, this Robot Ready report, and the conclusion of their analysis is we need humans plus skills all in one. And I think the whole conversation is a both and conversation throughout this afternoon, which basically says we need the liberal arts and we need the technical competencies, and we need them appropriately balanced and integrated into individuals pursuing different pathways. We can't have them packaged just into, a liberally educated individual here and a technically competent individual here. We've got to find ways to do that. And there are multiple ways to go forth with this, but I think some examples I would like us to hit home on. One, we are not taking full advantage of our general education programs to really weave in the value of liberal arts. And as we start to think about our gen eds in ways that are perhaps more developmental, more integrated, potentially theme-based, potentially culminating in a capstone experience, we can provide this whole set of skills that the Aspen Institute called out are very lacking in business majors and said business majors need a liberal arts education. You don't need 2 degrees. Let's use our gen ed. And then for students that are studying in fields, say art history, which is a wonderful field of study, we need to add in competencies, say coding. You can think of lots of other possibilities that help them get a job in the field they love, but with the skills that they need to get that first entry job. So Let me give you an example of this. And I'm focusing on the National Academy of Engineering and their grand challenges, again, because this is something Joan was involved in at the time she was at NSF, when one of our colleagues, Tom Khalil, in the White House, really put a stake in the ground in terms of the value of challenge-based education and got 100 deans of engineering schools to sign on to integrate the National Academy of Engineering's grand challenges that future engineers will need to solve, to weave that into their curriculum. NSF ran a competition to support challenge-based education, and this program has grown so that now the National Academy of Engineers runs an application process, a fairly extensive application process, to bring in other schools that get together regularly and support each other in a curriculum that prepares students to deal with the world of tomorrow, the jobs that don't yet exist, the challenges that are very complex that the University of Maine promises to prepare their students for. Well, there's these key competencies, and for those of you that are engineers, you'll look and say, well, that doesn't have a lot to do with engineering, perhaps. Maybe the talent competency, right? A mentored research experience, but multidisciplinary competencies, entrepreneurship competencies, multicultural competencies, social consciousness, the things that have long made engineering way back in time, profession that's in service of the public good. I'm going to add one more layer to this work because I happen to live at my college, which has a 3-2 engineering program, but is not an engineering school, just became the first non-engineering 4-year degree granting institution to become one of these National Academy of Engineering Grand Challenge Scholars schools. And the reason I'm sharing that is not rah-rah Rollins, but because the way we did it was through our general education. We have a developmental theme-based, translation challenge-based, integrated multidisciplinary gen ed that culminates in a capstone. And we were able to take that with the already very time-consuming science majors, weave them together to create these experiences. So I'll stop harping on general education now. Many of you know Robot Ready as T-shape, and when we think about T-shape individuals, they have this deep disciplinary expertise. They have the ability to work across disciplines and co-create. I'm thinking about the work Dr. Cordova has led with thinking about convergence as a key priority for the NSF. What does it take to really be a convergent thinker? In addition to that, you need very strong intrapersonal and interpersonal skills. There's long lists, but to just be clear about what I'm trying to convey: communication skills, problem solving, team skills, critical thinking, growth mindset, right? If I work hard enough at math, I can do this, and a sense that I belong. So again, all of these skills that are so important in terms of success in life and in the workforce. And again, during the time I was in Washington, there was a lot of conversation about how we weave this in. And this is another nice example of where research is so important. So what do we actually know about this? How can we measure these skills? Are there large-scale affordable interventions that advance these skills in students? So there's a great report that's actually hiding. I can't see over here, but the Supporting Students College Success came out of the National Academies, and it was part of a really intentional and deliberate effort at the NSF to provide these resources. But there's some great information in there if you're thinking about some large-scale implementations. And speaking of the National Academies, what I wanted to do was push hard that we have a very strong research base on how we can do a better job with educating our students that we should all draw upon. And for the most part, I'm going to go through 3 slides. They're all going to have pictures of reports. Most of them come from the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Mathematics. And I have 2 reasons for that. One is that much earlier in Joan's career, she played a pivotal role in leadership in the National Research Council at the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and that seemed like a nice way to honor that part of her career. In addition, it also illustrates areas where there's enough evidence that an august body of researchers can come together, analyze all the research that's out there, and arrive at a consensus. So it's a way of sharing. These are areas that we can pull upon in improving the success of our students, their success in learning, their success in persisting, retaining, and graduating with degrees. So how people learn too is how people learn revisited. It's how all learners learn. And what is compelling to me is it emphasizes this shift from generic how do undergrads or adults or young children learn to, and this is a Joan phrase, what works for whom and in what context, right? We're broadening that conversation, and it's an important one. There's a body of evidence on citizen science, great way to help us get our research done, and a great learning opportunity and science literacy opportunity for the general public. So who comes to the university? How are we best prepared for our pre-K-12 students? How do we best prepare teachers to go back in to the K-12 system? Well, this is another report revisited. Over a decade ago, the National Academies released a report called America's Lab Report, all about lab learning that was actually pretty useful for those of us in higher ed. And this new report is a complete update aligned with a lot of new research information that's come out. And then also, we know a lot about preparing our skilled technical workforce. So as we continue to think about how we shape the future, stepping away from the academies just briefly, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences this past year released a provocative roadmap and set of challenges for where we're going in undergrad education. And this whole forward-looking momentum, I find it very encouraging. And back to robot-ready, humans plus skills. Now we're back at the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. The humanities and arts plus the STEM field, branches from the same tree. Again, how do we think about this set of disciplines as being complementary and mutually reinforcing? And then how do we think about experiences for our students outside of the classroom? For 200 years, we've had students doing undergrad research. We believe, I'm a scientist, right? I believe deep, deep in my heart it is the best possible thing for students. But what data do we have? We actually do know that for students from underrepresented groups, early research experiences make a huge difference in their retention, their persistence, their graduation, and whether they go on to graduate study or not. We also know that the traditional apprenticeship type model, 10 weeks in the summer, doesn't include everybody. It's like when you go from being a parent with 2 children to 3, you don't have enough hands to hold, right? We can't do that. So there's some very good information in there about course-based research. How do we bring our research into the classroom in a way that we can scale this experience, which is really important to think about. And there's some really good information in there about mentoring, which makes me a little uncomfortable but also challenged. The students we're best at mentoring at are the students that are white. And so undergrad research, because we've not done the faculty development work to help people, is not as successful for all students. And as we talk about improving teaching, mentoring, you can't just say to faculty, okay, here's the data, now go change your behavior, right? That's unrealistic. So how do we treat faculty as learners? How do we learn from each other and move forward? And how do we move forward in a way that embraces new fields of study? So I put the data science report in there to challenge us. How do we remain current, responsive, and build? How do we think about supporting the public good? So what do we know about service learning, community engagement, actually an emerging field of doing community engaged or public scholarship with our students, not just contributing to the community, but doing the research there? How do we start to think about graduate education? The new report out of the National Academies on grad ed is, again, very challenging and exciting. And how are we more inclusive of all learners, whether they're English language learners or they come from different race and ethnic backgrounds, different socioeconomic status, first-generation students? The barriers and opportunities for 2-year and 4-year STEM degrees is one of the most data-rich reports I've seen, and it's eye-opening. We have work to do. And that's where I'd like to shift and push a bit on the challenging work we all continue to engage in with diversity and equity and inclusion. And economics is a huge issue, right? It's a huge issue for colleges and universities. It's an even bigger issue for our students. So in 2 generations now, well, maybe, yeah, it's almost 2 generations, going from 1970 to 2016. This is data from the Pell Institute. If we look at the percent of individuals coming from families in the lowest second, third, and fourth quartiles in terms of income, and we look at the probability they finish their degree, a bachelor's degree, by the age of 24, you'll see we've not made much progress in closing that gap, and maybe we've widened it a bit. So we're back here. This is the lowest SES quartile, right? The first quartile, 6% in 1970 versus about 40%. And if we move out to 2016, we've bumped up to 11% versus 58%. And if I was sitting there, I would say some of that happened long before college. It's about opportunity. They're not so well prepared. So what if we look at the top quartile of the college-going population in terms of SAT score and ACT adjusted score? This is now not graduating, but this is going to a 4-year school. 44% for the first socioeconomic quartile and 80% for the highest. So there's more than promise. We're losing a lot of opportunity. Recently, as in this year, 2019, using data from the National Center for Education Statistics, the beginning post-secondary student study, data has emerged that in the STEM majors, right, truly our Black and Latinx students leave at a higher rate than other majors in a way that can't be accounted for by socioeconomics. And this is very different. When I was at NSF, there was data that came out that showed all students switch, all students leave. But when you begin to disaggregate the reasons, again, we have more work to do. And why, beyond we need all the talent to solve the problems that we have out there, there's a lifetime earning potential difference. This is in 2009 dollars. There's a 74% difference in lifetime earnings between those that have a bachelor's degree and those that have a high school degree. And when this study was done, which is quite recently, it's Tony Carnevale's group at Georgetown, there was a 20% differential in lifetime earnings between African Americans and whites with bachelor degrees. As that was unpacked, much of that has to do with the fields of study different demographic groups pursue. So across the nation, there's been a shift in funding strategies to address the equity and inclusion issues. And Dr. Cordova and Dr. Freeney-Munday both played key roles in the NSF Includes effort that continues to be underway. And I'd say it's quite unusual for the director of the National Science Foundation to say, this is my key priority here, this is really important, and we're going to drive this home. At the similar times, the Gates Foundation was pushing really hard on inclusion. The Howard Hughes Medical Institute did a dramatic about-face from funding just the most privileged institutions to saying, we're going to figure out a way to reach and support the success of those students that typically have not had the same shot at succeeding in STEM. And for a period of time, the Department of Education ran a program called First in the World to move all students forward. So if we're going to have success for all learners, we have a difficult balancing act, right? The University of Maine, all of us are struggling with this. Quality is what we're aiming for, and how do we do that at a cost that's reasonable and in a way that's scalable? And the research is showing that while online learning plays an important role, the massive online open courses probably aren't the solution because it's not taking into context. And students, as more work is done on the MOOCs, learn more effectively when the learning environment is aligned with their learning environment, their goals. I think we're going to get a chance to maybe explore a bit about rural education and what that might mean in Maine in the conversation. I'm going to tell a very quick story about, again, this is at the federal level. It's a really positive story in my mind about what happens when research, policy, and funding are all brought together in a way to drive improvement. And I'm going to tell a story that actually is bigger than undergrad ed, but undergrad ed is my space, so I figured it's best to talk about things someone knows something about. So the spring of 2012, two key reports, the discipline-based education research report, which looked at what do we actually know about how students learn within disciplines. In this case, it was science and engineering, and why it's so important that the discipline plus the education research inform each other. And the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology released the Engage to Excel report. And there are lots of takeaways, but the key thing was we actually know a lot about improving education, and across the nation, we're not doing it. So this led to the first federal STEM education 5-year strategic plan. Dr. Cordova, Dr. Freeney-Munday both played a key role. I arrived at NSF I was watching Joan work across agencies, work collaboratively with people to get something that was really going to be meaningful and positive and research-based. So you have a plan, right? We've all seen strategic plans. They're great, but they're not enough, right? So take the undergrad objectives. Again, this plan covers far more than the undergrad objectives, but basically, let's use evidence-based practices. Let's use the work we know helps our students succeed. Let's focus on the 2-year to 4-year transfer situation and learning in our community colleges. Let's do a better job with the university-industry partnerships and think about internships, research experiences in a different way. Think to my comments earlier in this talk. And then let's see if we can do a better job of success in math. And kudos to the math community for stepping up to the plate in this. But it's still a plan. So implementation is key. There was a cross-agency priority goal, which was basically instructions to the agencies. Let's implement this plan and report back quarterly. So this plan was part of the National Science Technology Council's Committee on STEM Education. Dr. Cordova co-led that. Then there was a subcommittee designed, a federal coordination committee to actually implement the plan. Dr. Farini Munde, along with colleagues from NASA, co-led that. And then all these working groups, right? So, and I had the privilege of co-leading the undergrad group. So now we're doing that. It turns out that you also, if you're implementing something, you have to measure your progress. And I'll spare you the long sheets that were posted on the White House website. But I will tell you, we figured out that knowing if you're making progress or not is hard because getting good indicators is tough. So one of the things that came out of the effort at the undergrad level was another National Academies report on developing indicators, a system for all of the nation, not for individual institutions, although there's valuable information in there. I'm not sharing the suggestions for the metrics, the indicators, right? That's down in the weeds. But I do think it's interesting that the key goals that all these indicators come under are focusing on mastery of STEM. And again, you could expand this to other areas, right? We happen to be at the National Science Foundation, so that kind of bounded some of it, but much is transferable. How do we know we're making progress towards equity and inclusion, not just in terms of access, but success, right? And while that's subtle, I think the shift in the conversation from access to success is key. And how do we make sure we have, a ready workforce? So 5 years goes by quickly. There's now another 5-year federal STEM education strategic plan. And these are the 3 key areas of focus, and I'm excited to see where this goes. So outside the Beltway, right, there are national level things that have happened starting around 2011, 2012, the American Association of Universities that had focused entirely on advancing the research agenda for the first time in 25 years under Hunter Rawlings' leadership said, we should actually pay some attention to getting systemic change in undergrad teaching and learning. Developed a wonderful framework that acknowledges that changes in pedagogy come with scaffolding, creating the environment, right? To be change architects, we need to be architects of the context in which we're all working and change that context so it supports the desired outcome. And that all, if it went well, would lead to cultural change. They have a promising 5-year report in, and people are talking about being as excellent at teaching as we are at research. And looking ahead, AAU has just launched a PhD education initiative, largely spurred, again, with my research funding and policy kind of theme, this report on where we can improve graduate education. And if you read that, it sounds a lot like what we've been trying to do with undergrad ed. And I see it as a way that all we're learning in undergrad ed can appropriately and in a relevant way begin to serve as a foundation for grad ed. How do we make it more student-centered, and how do we start to think about pathways that actually exist? Because every grad student is not going to be able to become a future faculty member, nor do they necessarily want to. And I read recently that within the STEM fields, we've just hit a point where it's now half and half the number of PhDs that go into faculty positions and the number that pursue really exciting and important careers in other sectors. And I'm going to conclude by coming back to the land grants and the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities and Public Land and Sea Grant Universities. this Powered by the Publics initiative that University of Maine is part of. You know, my little triangle, I talked about scale, I talked about that with undergrad research. Who better to do that than leading research universities like the University of Maine? So this project is going to reach 130 universities, 3 million students, a third of which are Pell eligible, our lowest income students, and the goals are to increase the number of graduates, to close those achievement gaps I've been referencing, and to increase access to students from all backgrounds. And my understanding, I reached out to APLU so I think this is accurate, but Joan can tell me if I've misunderstood. So Maine is one of the lead institutions in this Powered by the Publics, which are clusters of institutions. And you probably already know this, except perhaps some of my NSF colleagues that are here. But dealing with these really hard questions about affordability, access, and success. How do you recruit more students? How do you retain students? And how do you get them to graduate? And I think that's an incredibly important project, and I am looking forward to watching how all of you contribute to that. And as my handoff to our panel discussion, again, what we all know, there's no silver bullet approach to student success because it takes all of us. I believe that when you approach this in a mission-aligned way, building on the promise we have to our students and delivering on that promise, we're partway there. When we think about liberal arts and professional studies as being mutually reinforcing, we go back to what our institutions were about from the beginning, but in a new way and in a very powerful way that lifts up the work that everybody in the university is doing. My plug, let's not miss an opportunity to use general education as a lever rather than the Chinese menu option that someone's doing and not understanding why they have to fulfill all these courses because I'm really interested in this. And when we bring together our research and our teaching and all the work in the real world, that's when we really create opportunities for inclusive excellence. And all of us, from students to faculty to staff to administrators, if we keep in mind that we're all learners and we're a learning institution, we're going to move forward further and faster. And at the end of the day, it's all about collaboration, right? Academic affairs can't do this without student affairs. They collectively can't do it without our enrollment. We can't do it without combining faculty development and student support, so we're identifying what our students need and delivering on that with the faculty. It's going to take all of us, and I think that's what's so exciting about this work and so challenging. So I'll stop there, and thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Singer. That was fantastic. We asked her to give us a bit of the national picture, and I think she did a fabulous job in about 25 minutes, really showing a lot of the great work that's going on, as well as a lot of the challenges that higher ed is facing now. What we want to do now is shift to more of a discussion. So, Susan, I'll ask you to grab a seat, anyone you'd like, and I'll introduce the rest of our panelists. So let me start with Dr. Habib Dagher. Habib is the Bath Iron Works Professor of Civil Engineering and the Director of the Advanced Structures and Composites Center. Habib, have a seat. And Dr. Elizabeth Allan is Professor of Higher Education here at the University of Maine. Darren Ranco is Associate Professor in Anthropology and the Chair of Native American Programs here. Dr. Emily Haddad, who's Professor of English and Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Where to begin? So let's start with some discussion about the sort of liberal arts base of education. And Dr. Singer shared some ideas about that, about looking more carefully at the general education as a way of achieving some of those goals, and also about integrating technical skills with the liberal education. And why don't we start with the general education idea? I'd say, I don't think I'm revealing any institutional secrets, that I'd say the University of Maine's current system falls on the Chinese menu end of the continuum. So I'm going to start with you, Dean Haddad, Emily, and give you a question that's probably very difficult to answer, but how do we move from where we are now to a space where we're looking at this as an integral part, and we've thought about these kind of skills that Susan laid out for us, and ensuring that students graduate with these skills. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think anybody's going to say that's a bad idea, right? So it's a good starting point. There are things that people are worried about, and that's a part of how we can move forward, is to face some of those worries head on. That departments, faculty are often concerned that they will lose out somehow in some tussle over gen ed territory. And that seems to me to be a fear to face and then approach in a really pragmatic way, but not to allow to be an obstacle. You're kind in saying it's a Chinese menu. I think it's a Chinese menu with some Thai and Lebanese thrown in, and not really focused on what we want students to be able to know and be able to do once they have completed it. But we are also a university of faculty members who are really capable of having some wonderful discussions around that topic, and I would welcome them.
Let's talk a little bit about that sort of how do we know question about getting at these skills, these community skills like leadership, multicultural competence, social responsibility. Maybe not right to call that a skill, but those areas of competency. I'm thinking of a couple of things. On one hand, there is this question that when we're presented the question, well, do students develop? So we say, of course they do, and they're covered in those courses. My thinking is, well, how do we know that they do? One, and two, if they're important, should we assume students start at the same point coming in? Or is there something to be said to looking at meeting the student where they are? Like, for example, many students come in with quite sophisticated communication skills, and yet we put them through the same set of check marks. So my question is a broad one about assessment of that, and about trying to figure out how do we individualize education around these broad skills. And I'm going to throw this out to anyone who wants to take a stab at it.
I'll speak because I hate the silences. I'm not going to tackle assessment. Maybe Elizabeth can help us there. What I like about liberal arts and whatever it's being called today, to not scare away funders or whatever, is the idea that we are educating the whole person, and that we're committed to that. And I was looking at Robert Dana, that for us in Native American programs, we work with a lot of entities on campus to ensure that, a lot of our students bring in different perspectives, different forms of knowledge that absolutely we have to meet them where they're at. And that approach and that old-fashioned, maybe now, liberal arts education of the whole person is really important to thinking about societal problems, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of that work as well, but in 1995, Lawrence Buell, the Harvard literary scholar, wrote, the environmental crisis is a crisis of the imagination, and that's still true however many years later. So in terms of how we teach and mentor students as whole people of all their things that they bring is such an important element to tapping into that creativity and harnessing it, because if the learning is merely in the classroom, I think we're failing. I think how we build community and how students experience that is a really critical part of a 21st century education. It cannot only be virtual or online.
Habib, I would speculate that you would suggest that the students who come through and work in your lab are developing some of these skills. How do we recognize that? I mean, they're not they don't get gen ed credit for working in your lab. How do we as an institution look at those kinds of experiences and include them in, not just the experiences, but the impact of those experiences in how we look at our impact on students?
Thanks for asking the question. Actually, it's one of the most important questions. And how do we grow, take that question to the next level? How do we provide this kind of experience to a larger number of students across the university? Maybe many of you don't know what we do. Maybe I'll talk a particular example. We got started under the National Science Foundation grant back in 1996, almost 23 years ago, and 4 of us faculty wanted to start a research center to add value to our natural resources in Maine. And if you look back after 20 years, almost 23 years, and you ask me, what are you most excited about? What I'm most excited about is providing more opportunities to more students to go through a lab. We've had over 2,300 students who've actually been through our laboratory over the last 20 years, from 35 different academic departments. And I tell everybody we're the non-denominational department. Okay? and this is where people actually can come together from different disciplines. They're business students, they're engineering students, they're physics students, math students, and others, communication students, and learn to discover themselves, learn how to work together, learn about the other disciplines, learn about what they don't know, learn as simple as I look in your eye when I talk to you. When I come out of school, a lot of engineers, particularly being an engineer, I can say that. Look at their shoes when they talk to you, and so learning these basic life skills, if you wish, are just as important as what we stuff in their heads, and more important than we stuff in their heads. And I look at people that are successful are the ones who actually learn how to do that. So the challenge really is how do we grow and create more students and provide more experiences like that to students. And in the next, I've been here for 33 years, I'm hoping in the next 33 years we'll be able to provide most of the students in this university with this kind of an experience. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Pete, because that does sort of segue into the next thing I wanted to ask about, which is, again, I was struck at the outset of your talk, Susan, about the results from the Purdue Pew survey, and that is such a small percentage of our students have these experiences of a professor who cares about me, of the mentoring experience, of a professor exciting them. And so my question for Susan or any of you is it does follow from Habib's point. We know these things are important. I don't think anybody would be surprised by reading what they are, that a professor shows he or she cares about me was important to a student's learning. I think what surprised most of us was this low percentage of students who report having had that experience. So the question is, what are some ways to bring these to scale? We're just again for context, you think of coming in to the University of Maine next fall, we'll have 2,375 students. I'm looking at our Vice President for Enrollment Management. And those students will come in. Many of them will we educate about 1,000 students in Psych 100 every year, about 700 students in First Calculus, and a similar number in Gen Chem or in English 101. What are some ideas, because there isn't one answer, there's no silver bullet, but what are some ideas about how do we bring to scale the opportunities for the students to have these kinds of experiences? Elizabeth, would you like to take the first shot at that?
Sure. Can you hear me? So, yeah, I think there are certainly some challenges associated with that, but some great opportunities, and I know there are folks who have been working on this. The Center for Innovation in Teaching and Learning here has great workshops and resources around this, but the question is, how do you integrate those high-impact practices that we know enhance and strengthen learning and that are more commonly associated with small group environments? How do you integrate those into the large scale, into a larger scale? How do you scale it up? And how do you make those large classes seem small? And there are people out there doing this. The Scholarship of College Teaching, there are studies and resources out there, strategies, for example, for instead of just lecturing, bringing more active learning into a lecture-style classroom by having think, pair, shares, by having jigsaws, by using clickers or poll anywhere technologies to keep the students engaged during the lecture. So you give a certain amount of, you provide a certain amount of material through lecture format, but then pause and ensure that the students are actively engaged. So, I mean, those are just some simple strategies within the classroom, but then also in structuring the syllabus, the course syllabus, providing opportunities for more peer learning, for peer review, for small group work and collaboration. We know that all these things in the research, we know that these are associated with better learning outcomes. And there's no reason why we couldn't integrate those into large classes as well.
Great. Other thoughts on that, on how we can bring these to scale? Let me ask a leading question. Do you think there technologies can help us with that, or is technologies, and again, this is a broad statement because technologies is a very inclusive statement, but newer technologies, can they help with that, or are they potential risks? What are your thoughts on that?
I'll say both, but I want to give an example from a job candidate I recently interviewed who said that he had students close their eyes before raising a hand to indicate whether they needed more explanation of a topic. Because in a class of 50, with their eyes open, 2 students would raise a hand, maybe. And with their eyes closed, it could be as many as 40 of the 50 students. And I said, well, clickers could accomplish that too, right? Like, why do it this way, where it's binary? It's a yes or no, their hands are raised or they're not. And he said, well, it's just more immediate that way. And I thought that, and this was someone in a STEM field, I thought this was a really interesting way of kind of acknowledging the human and embodiedness of that self-reflective moment. Zero cost.
That's great. Very low tech. Yeah. Others. Let's talk. We started to talk about integration of teaching and research with Habib's great example in his lab. I want to follow up on that and ask another question. And this one is directly to you, Habib. So you've been here 32 years, and I know that because we started on the same day. But people look at your lab and they say, wow, look at the Advanced Structures and Composites Center, and they have 130 students, and they have, I don't know how many scientists in and out of there. Okay. If the goal is to think about integrating teaching, research, and service in a single entity, and you're looking at a first-year new faculty member, what's your advice?
Very, very good question. There's a lot of things certainly a first-year faculty could do. But I think the biggest and most important advice is learn how to care. Learn how to care. Treat the students as if they were your children, your own children. Look at the student in the eye and say, that's my child. That's another 18-year-old that's coming through my life. As soon as you start to care, everything after that happens. And that's, I think, what we're missing in our society. By working in a classroom, you have less opportunity to interact with people. You have less opportunity to talk to people. When you work in a lab, you have to talk to people. You have to interact with people. You have to learn to care. And what I've learned over the last 33 years are the people who succeed are not necessarily the people who have a lot of stuff in their head. It's the people who care about others and really do it genuinely and learn how to care. So by working together in teams, people learn how to care, they learn how to form teams, and that's when they succeed. So from a faculty member, learn how to care about the students, learn how to be part of a team, and all the other stuff follows.
When the engineer says learn how to care, I think there's enough said about that right there on our panel. I want to follow up on the idea about integrating research experiences into the classroom. And again, it's sort of as to quote Emily earlier, who could argue with it? It's a great idea. What are some of the challenges of doing that, of integrating a real research experience into classes?
Well, I remember back in the 20th century when we would say, there was this sense that, a faculty member who's doing a lot of research isn't doing good, like somehow those are at odds. That was a mythos out there. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of it. I'm joking. That, where's your professor? They're out doing all their research. But I really think and I think, again, where the University of Maine is good, and I'm sure will be better because of the way the leadership is committed to this, is that, and I can't describe, as an instructor, how exciting it is to present my research, which is really about connecting people to issues and projects and, the viability of our environment for Indigenous people. However that works, I'm teaching a class on Indigenous science across the curriculum, right, where we're looking at in all these different specific projects how it is that Indigenous science and Western science works together to solve problems, and that is never going to come from the textbook in a way, and even just bringing the problem-solving elements of that work and breaking it down for students connects them so much more immediately to the things that are real to them as students and as members of our society. So I just think an engaged researcher teaching classes like that, just the excitement level goes from 1 all the way up to 11, in my opinion.
Just add briefly, I wholeheartedly agree. I think that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. There's so much synergy, and that's what I would offer to a new faculty member is the trust in that if there's hesitation because of the time commitment. It's one of those cases where I think you have to slow down a little bit to then go fast, because once it clicks in with the synergy and the inspiration with the students, and the students asking critical questions that help you learn and refine your research methods or how you articulate the research problem, it's mutually beneficial, and it takes you further. So,
Emily?
One of the things that is really hard for people who are trained like me in the 20th century is to give up on the idea of coverage. We have to cover these concepts, and if we haven't covered them, we haven't done our job and we haven't been responsible. And whether the students are actually able to master and retain what we have covered often gets lost as a question in the commitment to coverage. So I think one of the key sort of emotional and cultural steps that faculty members need to take in moving towards the wonderful goals that my colleagues are describing is to back off from the ideal of coverage as the primary value. And it is hard, but also very worth doing.
Actually, I think that's an excellent point. If you look at some of the things that Susan shared with us about the skills and some of the things that I know that we've all read about what skills employers are looking for. And they're the kind of things that you saw: ability to work, to problem solve, ability to work in groups, competencies in communication, et cetera. You don't see, I'll choose from my own discipline, right? You don't see, they didn't have quite in-depth coverage of E.C. Tolman's model of cognitive learning in mice. And yet, when I taught that class, I thought everyone should understand E.C. Tolman's model for cognitive learning in mice because it's so fascinating. And I made sure we covered it. Fortunately, I don't teach that anymore for the students. But it's a great point. If we think about what are the goals, what are the big picture goals that we're after, and that's an excellent point. Not to get too too connected to any good course in fill in the blank has got to cover fill in the blank. Okay, I want to ask a little bit. I want to follow up a little bit on some of the challenging findings that Susan showed to us about differences between underrepresented students and sort of your white students in achievement. And I don't think any of these surprise any of us. I think we're very familiar with it. We're engaged right now at the University of Maine in an effort to look at just at first year retention. And our data look like most data from most universities in the United States. We do okay, but if you break it down, our underrepresented students leave more frequently. Our students who are Pell eligible leave more frequently. What I was intrigued here is that by one of the things you showed was about parsing out, if I followed it correctly, when you parse out the effects of income, social economic status, you still get these differences. I think you talked about Black and Latinx students in STEM disciplines leaving. So here's another big picture challenge for higher education. Now, everyone knows, look at the demographics of our country, increasing Hispanic. If you look at the segments of our population who are where there's the most opportunity to bring more to our colleges, they tend to be the underrepresented groups. My question again for anyone is how do we, what do we do with those findings, right? How do we take those and think about action? How do we move to the next step? On the one hand, you could shake your head and say, yeah, well, we're behind in retention for underrepresented students, but so is everybody else. It's a bummer. How do we go to the next step, and what are some of the things we ought to be considering and thinking about as institutions to try to close that gap? Again, I'll invite anyone to come.
Oh, I'll start, I guess. So I think that we think of inclusive excellence in a number of different ways. It's very complex, of course. And how we define diversity. We're talking about diversity in the curriculum, diversity as it's reflected in sociocultural identities. All of that matters for student learning. The research bears that out. It is, though, a goal we're still trying to achieve, and I think we start with the issue of access. We started that years ago, decades ago, access to higher education, and we thought that would bring equity. And then when that happened, in many cases, it didn't. it didn't feel equitable, and so then we looked at representation. Well, where are minoritized individuals studying, or are they in the leadership roles, et cetera? And so then focusing on equitable representation across different sectors of the campus is an important aspect of inclusive excellence. But I think where we really need to put more effort is in climate as well. And I think that's, that is going to require a lot more intentional focus, and in climate meaning the perception that students have of how the institution feels for them. And I think it's really, we've done many people are doing lots of great things to enhance the climate for inclusive excellence. And I think we also, as we celebrate difference, we also have to look at the privilege of the majority in whatever identity categories we're thinking about, and ask folks to examine that privilege, because that will help to shift the campus climate to support inclusive excellence. And if we don't do that, then I think we'll be stalled out. And it's a great opportunity for us in Maine to shine the spotlight, as Peggy McIntosh talks about, unpacking the invisible knapsack of privilege, and looking at the arithmetic of the upside, and asking students to critically reflect. And this goes back to the importance of the liberal arts as well, but providing those opportunities, structured opportunities, to critically reflect on their own identity and the way in which their majority status might be influencing how they interact with other students and contributing to a climate that might be inhospitable, unknowingly so.
Yeah, if I could just build upon that. I think what's emerging, and I think this is very hopeful, the two strands of this are what I would consider a social justice, a recognition of past lack of access to education, a host of other kinds of issues that get built into that along privilege. But then I think what's also a really powerful move, and NSF and President Frini Mundi recently testified in support of these ideas around convergence, which and related concepts, which are basically a more diverse educational experience lifts all boats, right? The 21st century will be defined by people working across boundaries to solve problems that affect us all. And I think that, no one, as you mentioned, no one's maybe getting the balance of those elements correct per se, but I think we have a real opportunity to work on them. Obviously for us, and again, this, my recognition of the NSF people I have an Includes grant that is really what that Indigenous science across the curriculum class is being funded by, to move the needle in the classroom, outside the classroom, how we build community towards inclusivity. Sometimes it looks a little scary. I'm never good at the emotional context of like, here, now I will shepherd you. Why didn't you learn about colonization? I don't know, but you have to deal with it somehow. I'm not good at dealing with anyone's emotional response to that.
Talk to Habib, he's very good.
Okay, that said, yeah, care first. That said, I think, for us, our campus is on Marsh Island. We are in Penobscot territory. That is a great, responsibility, act towards justice and opportunity that I feel like we're taking advantage of to say, how do we fashion a future that is inclusive truly in all the many ways that raises everyone, that solving problems in the workplace, the studies are repeatedly done year after year now, like those who are thinking in more diverse ways create better solutions, longer term solutions, and in better work environments. So this isn't just some airy-fairy, like us in the ivory tower, we like to create whatever safe space, I believe in safe spaces, believe it or not, but it is so pragmatic on a deeper level, and if we can harness that sense of its practicality, and I know to fix it's kind of expensive and it's risky in some contexts, but it is just such an important part of all the problems and social issues that we're going to face.
So Darren is a very humble guy and is not actually saying what his program is about, but
I've never been accused of humble. That's good.
Right. But the part of the beauty of it is that it is reaching not only out from the university in a generic way, but also specifically to youth, so that it is directly affecting the way that Native youth think of themselves as potential scientists. And broadly speaking, that is something that we should be considering with respect to all youth in whatever place they see their talents. But seeing your talents is that's something that is very much part of your context. You can't see a talent in a thing that you don't know exists, or that you don't perceive as part of your world. And offering that is a really important way in which our land grant mission gets extended into the education of people who are not students and may never become students at the University of Maine.
Thank you. I'm in charge of the clock, so I'm watching, and I would like to ask you some more, but I promise to give the audience some opportunity to ask a few questions. So I want to open it up, and I'll do my best. Oprah or Phil Donahue kind of bring the microphone to you. Let me ask, questions just for the panel? Comments on anything that you've heard? And let them throw it open.
Okay, I'll be first. I'm an engineer. I graduated from Mario in '63 and then went on to do other things. One thing that I noticed is very different in engineering education today is that the lack of the humanities that was present. My department head had 2 degrees, a BA in English and BS in electrical engineering. God help the person who went in and complained about the liberal arts courses. But I also took 6 courses in humanities, 18 credit hours, more than 10% of my program, literature, economics, psychology, music appreciation, art appreciation, and in 1962, a very appropriate course, problems in Southeast Asia. The important thing is I have used all of these in my professional career, not just my personal life. I think we need to add some of those back. I don't know how.
You're looking at Habib, but I'm not going to put my pick on review. Go ahead.
I'd like to take that a bit outside the classroom, if you wish. Students spend so much time in their classes, but they spend so much more time outside the classes. Right, and that's where they can really be impacted. And that's where the research experience is President Farini Mundi's research plan that she's developing towards the future. One of the goals here is a research experience for every student on this campus, which is a tremendous goal. So it's outside the classroom, potentially, in these large research labs or other labs on campus where these students can interact and learn about each other. Not study just about diversity in a book, but learn by working with somebody that's different next to you. Learn to care about them, learn about their problems. That's really when you really learn. And those are the kinds of life-changing experiences you get. I'll give you examples. One thing we're trying to do over the next 5 years from our strategic plan is to house just about every undergrad student who work in the lab, give them an office. So they can all actually start being in offices. They belong there. This is their home. Okay? Then everybody who's their peers becomes their friend. Everybody who's their peers becomes somebody they work with every day. And guess how many hours they can work together every year? Up to 30 hours a week during the academic year and full-time in the summer and the breaks. Add that up, that's more than 2 years of full-time experience interacting with others that are diverse, that are different than you, learning about the different departments, electrical engineers, working with chemical engineers, working with physics students, with math students, with communication students and business students and so forth. That's when they're going to really learn. And so creating those opportunities where the students can belong and take their experience outside the classroom and work together in teams is invaluable. So that's my answer. And those engineers that work in my lab, when they have a business students next to them and economic students on the other sides and the communication students on the other side, they get it because they live it. Okay.
Susan.
Yeah, so I actually went to engineering school also and completely concur with your experience. I was the person that took 6 or 7 courses so I could get the extra history courses and philosophy courses. And my favorite engineering course was Existential Pleasures of Engineering. It was an awesome course. There are a couple things as I reflect back on that experience, right? We don't encourage students to take quite as many courses anymore. And as much as I hate to admit it, that's probably a good thing if we're creating the learning experience so they're doing more in-depth work with each of the courses that they're taking so that there's real learning going on versus accumulating a number of courses. That said, I wanted to share with you 2 things. One, I actually think the accrediting body in engineering, the ABET accreditors, have done a relatively remarkable job compared to, I get to deal with lots of accrediting bodies in my current position, but the way they've woven in ethics, team learning, other skills that we implicitly assumed we might have gotten from other courses, I think is to their credit. I think the challenge in engineering is it looks like so many courses, and there are some institutions that have figured out or negotiated with ABET ways to achieve the competencies with fewer courses. I've seen that in places. I've been also with teacher certification, another place where there's so much that you have to do, and really building good relationships with your state Department of Education so that you can accomplish the same thing, but maybe with fewer courses and richer experiences. And I would say that the engineering educators have thought a lot about this. One of the things my division funded at NSF that has continued are some of the major engineering schools nationally trying to figure out how to develop a liberal arts and engineering undergraduate degree. And a lot of that rose because I've often been in places that have 3-2 programs. And liberal arts plus the engineering. But think about, if you have a great learning environment, who wants in their senior year to pick up and move to another institution, start all over, and miss out on those really deep friendships and end of the year celebrations? So I think a lot of that, over a 20-year period, the relatively small number of students that have engaged in 3-2 programs, although that's shifting a little. Columbia had to just change their program because they have so many people coming in, that this liberal arts and engineering degree is really interesting to consider, right? It puts you at a disadvantage perhaps with sitting for the professional engineering exam, but how many current engineering jobs require you to be a professional engineer? Yes, if you're going to build a bridge, please. But engineering is so broad and so diverse, so there may be some ways to think really creatively about this, and I think there's some nice examples out there that may or may not resonate.
Other thoughts or questions for the... Elizabeth, you can shout it out. You're young and hardy.
I'm Elizabeth. I'm a grad student here at UMaine in biomedical science, and I just want to know your thoughts on what you think about a core curriculum for graduate students. We talked about liberal arts for undergraduates, but how would that play into a grad degree as well?
Emily, you want to take first shot?
This one's a hard one. So I think that having students reach beyond what they see as their central area in graduate school is really valuable. To do a core curriculum that would apply across all graduate programs is a little hard for me to visualize in a way that students would find relevant and useful. So I would see it as do a plus, but not necessarily the same plus for everybody, just off the top of my head.
Habib?
I'd just like to say, being a grad student, you don't have to finish in a year and a half or two. It's up to you, right? You don't have this 4-year kind of a deadline. Take your time. Take as many classes as you want. It doesn't matter if they're part. That's what I tell all my students. If you're having fun and you're learning, why stop?
I wonder if there are any structural constraints to that, and my colleagues at UMaine would know. So I was the grad student, right? I told you I love history. So I convinced my department when I was in graduate school to allow me to take graduate courses in history. But it turns out there's this little thing called a budget and dollars in different departments. And I must have been either very convincing or very pathetic looking that they moved the dollars. But I wonder structurally, is this, I went to grad school a long time ago. Is this structurally possible today at UMaine? Can students move easily amongst departments in their course taking?
It is possible. I mean, it depends on what your funding source is. And our standard assistantship pays for, 9 credits, up to 9 credits per semester and 6 in the summer. And you can use those. Now, I think Elizabeth hit on the key thing. your advisor and your advising committee need to say it's okay for you to do that. We require all our students to put forward, all our graduate students, a plan of study, and I think they'd have to be, they'd have to use their good liberal arts education skills to convince their committee and that this is a good use, particularly if their funding is coming from granting sources that their research advisor could use for other purposes. That's a little bit of a tougher sell. But we have about 220 University of Maine funded assistantships, and Claire, who's here, will get mad at me when I say this, but there's less oversight on exactly what courses students take to fill those requirements, so it's really more convincing that it's a good use of your time and effort that Elizabeth will have to do with her advisor and others.
Jeff, if I may, just to follow, just real briefly,
sure.
In the interest of convergence, right, there is the structural kind of pieces of we would want you to be more, right, inclusive. What it does, though, for us on the faculty side is very important, and I think Emily is very good at thinking about this, and others here, that we need to be mindful then of strong mentoring for our graduate students as they, it's one thing to be in a very structured program where everyone's taking the same classes in over a 2 or 3 year period, and then that's it, and we all know what that accreditation is and blah, blah, blah. We're saying, no, we want a more diverse set of skills for you as a grad student. That requires, I think, a structure of support and mentoring that, and I would say a diverse structure, I mean, with diverse people and diverse strategies, because when you break it down where it's not structured in a certain way, then it tends to be, that's where we fail in our diversity thing, because like attracts to like, oh, I see myself, that's the person from my background, and I get where they're coming from. That's where it becomes not very helpful in supporting the diversity of our students.
That's a great point. Allan.
So I'm a psychologist, and I don't recall ever learning Tolman's model, at least not in a course. And I'm also at the Center for Community Inclusion and Disability Studies. I actually want to sort of answer not exactly the question that was raised, but to talk about structural issues in graduate education. Gen ed might not work, except for, if you're in a research-based field, certainly ethics of research is something that pertains somewhat to that. But when I went to grad school in the 20th century, we were required to have a graduate minor at University of Wisconsin. And that forced you to do something outside your home department and to broaden. And you either had to pick from a established program that every department would shop around to the students, or you had to use your persuasive skills to convince your advisor to approve a program of study, a small program of study of 4 graduate courses, with some coherence to them. Obviously, how hard you had to work to make that argument depended on your audience, but it was something structural that did foster that kind of breadth.
I'll just jump in that we, in the higher ed graduate programs, we do have that. Currently, it's been in existence for 20 plus years, where in the 36-hour master's degree, 12 hours are individualized, and we encourage students to take courses interdisciplinary. And in the doctoral program, there's an 18-hour specialization, so there is that opportunity for both. And it is a selling point of the program.
I think we've got time for one more question. I'll let Stefano have that privilege.
Thank you. My name is Stefano Tijerina, and I teach in the Maine Business School. And one thing that has not been mentioned, but I find it's important to consider within the holistic education is the aspect of globalization. So how do we prepare, from your perspective, just the whole institution and the whole strategic plan so that we can teach American students to think global, when the United States is one of the nations that is most insular and more nationalist thinking and less global thinking within the whole context of the planet?
Stefano, I said that you could have the last question, but I think you've made the last statement, and and that's okay. I want to, before we close, we want to thank our panelists, but we'll start first with Dr. Singer. And we have a small gift here of appreciation for her. So please join me in thanking Dr. Singer for this. In case you're curious, it's full of all things Maine blueberry. And I want to thank also, please join me in thanking the rest of the panelists who don't get blueberry packages, because they all live here and they can get at it. So thank you all. Joan, not to put you on the spot, would you like to say anything before we close?
Yes, it is kind of on the spot, but that's okay. First of all, thank you to Susan for coming out and for offering us such provocative and thoughtful and interesting comments, and to all of our panelists. Each of you raised great insights and helped us to think about our university and what we do here in the context of higher education more broadly. Thank you to our audience, which is a very diverse group here, people from all parts of our university and well beyond that. And I really do hope this conversation continues. I was wondering if the provost was going to call on me to ask questions, because I had a pretty long list, but I know how to find all four of our faculty folks. And I think there's much more to be had in this discussion, right, about diversity and its place in learning, about faculty professional development and skills for doing the kinds of things that are being discussed here. And then for me, I'm very interested in the assessment questions and in so much of what I heard here about what we're already doing here at the University of Maine, and then how we may be able to, through assessment, frankly, be more clear about the impact that is having on our learners. So stay tuned, and we'll have Susan dial into these calls. But I really look forward to more conversation. I want to thank Provost Hecker for designing what was, for me, a very provocative and interesting and exciting panel. So thank you all for coming.
Well, thank you all very much. I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow at the inauguration, right next door in the CCA. Thank you.